Hello, my name is Nigel Griffiths. I work in the Advanced Technology Centre in the UK as part of IBM Europe. This movie is about workload partitions, or WPAR for short, and application mobility, where we move these WPARs between machines. This is all part of AIX6. In this first mini-movie, we're going to look at what are workload partitions and how does the Workload Partition Manager fit in. The workload partition software comes in two parts. The first comes with AIX itself. If you've installed AIX6, then you already have all the software you need to create and look after your workload partitions. This allows you to create a couple of thousand workload partitions on each copy of AIX. The second part is called the Workload Partition Manager. This is an extra software package that needs to be purchased, and this gives you a number of things. This includes the live application mobility, the way we can move a workload partition from one machine to another. It also gives you the graphical user interface. You can see a little snapshot here. This allows you to find all the machines running workload partitions and your workload partitions so that you get a good view of what's going on, and you can control them all with this graphical user interface. It also gives you an automated policy-based way of managing your workload partitions, so it will automatically move a partition if necessary. Let's look at some of the details now of a workload partition. We can run a workload partition wherever we can run AIX6, so this is on the Power 4, the Power 5 or Power 6 machines, or in the Power Blades, the JS20 or 21. We can run AIX either in the whole machine or just in a logical partition, a part of machine. A good way of thinking of a WPAR is that it's a lightweight miniature copy of AIX running within AIX itself. The WPAR will share global resources with the copy of AIX. So there's only a single AIX kernel, and it will be taking some processing power from the processors, memory and adapters of the global copy of AIX. Each workload partition usually shares the /user and /opt file systems read-only with the global copy of AIX, and then has private copies of the file systems root, /temp, /home and /var. It also usually has its own network IP address and hostname, so you can telnet to it, for example, and it looks just like a regular copy of AIX. It also has separate administrative and security domains, so each workload partition has its own root user that can do its own things with its own file systems. And we can regulate the use of the resources with the global instance by using the same mechanisms as AIX Workload Manager has for many years now. There are two types of workload partition, a system partition and an application partition. I can immediately see three good uses for live application mobility. Firstly, if we've got a new machine just installed and we install AIX6 on it, we can right now move some workload partitions onto this new machine so that we can make use of these new resources immediately, rather than having to wait a number of days perhaps to move workloads to it. Secondly, we have balancing of workload across a group of machines. Perhaps we want to move them over for load balancing our CPUs to gain better performance. And thirdly, perhaps we want to take a machine down for a number of reasons. We might be doing green computing. We want to take a machine out to save the power perhaps over a weekend. Or perhaps we want to upgrade the copy of AIX or the firmware on the machine, or perhaps there's a repair action. Perhaps we're adding extra adapters to a machine. But for whatever reason, we can use mobility to move those workloads temporarily off a machine, and then once we've completed our operations, we can move them back onto that machine to make use of it. There are two types of workload partition, application and system. And let's start with the system. This is what I like to think of as a miniature copy of AIX. We'll create it and it goes into the defined state. Then when we run it, it goes active, and we can stop it as well and then run it later on if we want to, like a copy of AIX. It runs its own services. For example, it runs its own inetd, cron and syslogs. And it has its own set of users, so it has its own root user and its own groups, so we can manage it in its own right. It doesn't share any file systems with either the global copy of AIX or any other workload partitions. And it will exist for a long time, so that we can live with this over a number of months or years, until we finally want to stop it and remove it. The alternative is an application workload, and this is a workload partition that is built around an individual application. When we start that application, we create a workload partition around it, and as soon as that application stops, then the workload partition is also removed. That actual process that we start for this application workload, it can of course start other sub-processes, and it can exist for quite a long time. A typical example that I can see is the use of high-performance computing, when you have an application or a group of processes that will run for perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. One of the nice features of workload partitions is that we can actually checkpoint these workload partitions running a long job, and we can hibernate them. So we can temporarily stop them, move them out of the way, perhaps run another more important workload, and then restart it exactly where it stopped and let it continue for the last couple of days. Let's have a look at Workload Partition Manager. It's a piece of software that we install on a copy of AIX6. We then go to each of the machines or logical partitions running AIX6 where we have workload partitions running or we plan to have them, and we install the Workload Partition Manager agent. We then run a single command to configure this agent to talk to the Workload Partition Manager. The Workload Partition Manager then can see the workload partitions running on each of these machines and can control them. We interact with the Workload Partition Manager by using a web browser on our desks, and we talk to the web server that it's actually running. And we'll see in other movies what this looks like and how to actually use it. We now have then on our desktop a way of managing and looking at all the systems running workload partitions as a whole. We can create new workload partitions, we can start and stop them, we can move them using mobility, and we can finally remove them if we don't want them any further. We can also, with Workload Partition Manager, move them around automatically to optimize the use of our machines. If one machine becomes overworked, we can move workload partitions from that machine to other lightly used machines. And from this single console we can do all these sorts of operations, and we'll look at those later. Now let's have a little look at mobility, or relocate as it's called when you actually try to do it. How does that actually work? Well, on the Workload Partition Manager screen, you'd select the WPAR, then you click on Relocate, select the target machine you want it to move to, and hit OK, and it will magically do that for you in the next couple of seconds. But how is it actually doing that? Well, it's using two commands that come with the Workload Partition Manager under the covers. Firstly, it runs this checkpoint command. This freezes the WPAR, and we save all the WPAR processes, it's the memory and the state of those processes, into what's called a state file on NFS. This does mean that there's a prerequisite there that if you want mobility, the file systems for your WPAR do have to be mounted via NFS. Once we've saved all those details, the processes and the kernel state for those processes, we can then kill off those processes once they're no longer needed. All the information required to restart this WPAR is used by the restart WPAR command, and that takes that state information, rebuilds the processes and the kernel state, and then restarts the WPAR on the new machine, or the new copy of AIX. Before we go and look at workload partitions hands-on and see how to use and operate them, let's have a think about the main reasons for using workload partitions. The first one that comes to mind is reducing the system admin time. If you can imagine running 20 copies of AIX, we have 20 copies to install and update and monitor and look after. But if we have one copy of AIX running 20 WPARs, we actually reduce the system's administration time quite significantly. We have encapsulation of our applications. If we're running more than one workload on a copy of AIX, better to put them into workload partitions, and then we can monitor and control them in detail and really get a hands-on idea of what's going on our machine. We can also create and destroy workload partitions very quickly. So if we need perhaps a test machine or a training machine, instead of allocating a whole machine or a logical partition, we can rapidly create a WPAR, use it for a while, and then remove it if we don't need it further. We also have the ability that each WPAR has its own users and groups and root user. This means that your global AIX administrator can give root authority to somebody to manage their WPAR without jeopardizing the security of the global copy of AIX. We also have reduced cost. Instead of perhaps running 20 copies of AIX, and I'm guessing here, but say each of those needs 100 megabytes of memory to run as an absolute minimum. This means by running 20 WPARs, we're already saving 2 gigabytes of memory. And because each WPAR will share, or normally shares, the /user and /opt file systems, we actually reduce the amount of disk space as well. Each WPAR as a minimum takes between 50 and 60 megabytes of disk space. But then we have the real luxury option when we have live application mobility. This brilliant idea where we can move workloads between machines very quickly, and that we can move workloads off a particular machine if we need to take it down for whatever reason. Well, that's enough of the theory. In movie 2 we're going to look at the workload partition manager. We'll log on, have a look around, and we'll start and stop some workload partitions.